Wyoming Territory, 1878. The wind blew sharp through the town of Bent Creek as the gallows were built, and the sheriff laughed when the cowboy took her. The noose creaked in the breeze. Sheriff Wendell caught the sight of it from his office window and chuckled low, shaking his head. "He is a fool," he muttered, tipping back in his chair. The cowboy had a name, Yates Trenton, and he was not a man who talked much. He had ridden in from the southern plains 2 days back, dust in his beard and a quiet way about him. Folks said he had a ranch 3 hours east, tucked between the Laramie foothills and a stretch of cottonwoods that never quite turned gold in fall. She was Georgia Pruitt, 23. The preacher's daughter, though that preacher had been dead 3 years and nobody had seen a Bible in her hand since. She lived above the dry goods store, took in mending work, and raised 2 children that were not hers, Danny and Daisy. Sheriff Wendell told folks she was soft in the head for keeping the little ones after their parents took off. "A woman like that's just asking for ruin," he'd say. But still, she walked to church every Sunday, held those children like they were born from her bones, and never asked a soul for anything. So when Yates Trenton rode up to the sheriff's office that morning, nodded once and said, "I will take her," the old lawman just laughed. "You got rope burns on your brain, cowboy," Wendell barked, leaning forward. "You know who she is." Yates's jaw didn't move. "She is not the one you say she is." Wendell stood, pulled his coat from the peg, and stepped out onto the street, still chuckling as he watched Georgia pack a satchel and take the hands of the children. Danny, 5, already squinting like he had seen too much. Daisy, 7, her curls tied up with a blue ribbon Georgia had made from an old dress hem. Yates waited by his horse, reins in one hand, the other resting loosely on his hip. He met Georgia's eyes and she nodded once. No words, no touch, just a nod. The sheriff called out, "You think dragging her out to that lonely ranch is going to make a wife out of her?" Yates looked over his shoulder, calm and quiet. "No," he said. "I think it will give her peace." And then they were gone. The ride was long and the sun was low by the time they reached the ranch. It was not much. A 1-floor cabin with a stone chimney, a barn that leaned to the right, and a well out back with a rope-pulled bucket. But the place was clean, and the fence post stood straight. Yates helped Georgia down first, then lifted Danny and Daisy from the saddle, one small hand at a time. He did not speak until after he fed the horses and stoked the fire inside. "You can have the bedroom," he said. "I will take the cot." Georgia stood by the doorway, eyes scanning the shelves lined with jars of beans, the boots tucked neatly by the door, the rifle above the hearth. "Why are you doing this?" His voice was low. "Because you look tired of being alone." She did not answer. She just walked over to the window and pulled back the curtain. The dusk light fell soft across her face. Daisy tugged gently on Yates's sleeve. "Is this where we live now?" He crouched to meet her eye. "If you want it to be." Danny had already found the wooden horse carved from pine and was dragging it across the floor, wheels groaning with each pull. Georgia watched him, hands tight around her arms. Yates noticed. "They will be safe here," he said. She nodded. The days settled quiet. Yates worked the land, fixed the barn wall before the snow came, taught Danny how to tie a knot that would not slip, and helped Daisy feed the chickens every morning. Georgia cooked meals, mended clothes, and once, when she thought no one was watching, she sang an old hymn by the fire. That night, Yates leaned on the porch rail beside her. "I heard you sing," he said. "I didn't mean to," she replied, cheeks pink from the cold wind. "I liked it." She looked at him, then really looked and saw not a stranger, but a man with tired eyes and a steady hand. "You built all this yourself?" she asked. He nodded. "After the war. Took 4 years, still not done. Seems like it is enough." He turned to her. You are the first person to say that. 1 week later, the sheriff rode up the trail with 2 deputies behind him. He stopped at the gate, squinting at the house. "You still alive, Trenton?" Wendell called. Yates stepped out of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. "What do you want?" Wendell dismounted, walking slow. "Just wanted to see if the preacher's girl had come to her senses." Inside, Georgia stood still, holding Daisy close. Danny peeked out from behind the curtain. Yates's voice was calm, but his shoulders squared. "You laughed when I took her. You will not laugh now." Wendell chuckled. "What are you going to do, throw me off your land?" From the porch, Georgia stepped out. Her voice was clear. "I am not going back, Sheriff." Wendell looked surprised. "You think that Cowboy will make you a wife?" "No," she said. "I think he already made me a home." Yates moved beside her, hand brushing hers just enough. She did not pull away. The sheriff spat in the dirt. "You are all fools." Then he rode off. That night the wind howled again, but the fire inside burned warm. Danny fell asleep curled near the hearth, Daisy tucked under Georgia's arm. Yates poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one to her. She looked at the steam rising between them, then at his face. "I never belonged anywhere," she said quietly. "Not really." "You do now," he said. She reached across the table and rested her hand on his. He turned his palm to meet hers, and for the first time in years she smiled, not the polite kind, not the forced one, a real smile. Yates said nothing. He only held her hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. And maybe for them it was. The first frost came quiet, silvering the fence rails and curling the last of the garden leaves before sunrise. Georgia stood at the stove, sleeves rolled to her elbows, shaping biscuits with steady hands. Daisy sat nearby with a needle in hand, trying to hem a worn apron under Georgia's watch. Danny was still asleep in the small corner, bed Yates had built from scrap pine, his breathing slow and even. Yates stepped in from the cold with his coat dusted in white. He carried a burlap sack of chopped wood over one shoulder and shut the door with his boot. Georgia glanced at him but didn't speak right away. "You'll need to start keeping the kindling inside," she said after a moment, brushing flour from her fingers. "That wind's going to bite harder before long." He set the sack down near the hearth. "Notice the same. There's a crack in the south wall of the barn. Snow'll find its way through if I don't patch it before week's end." Georgia handed Daisy the scissors without taking her eyes off Yates. "You'll need help with that. I'll manage. You always say that." He didn't argue, only tugged off his gloves and hung them by the stove. Daisy looked up, caught the sound in her mother's voice, and returned to her stitching without saying a word. When breakfast was done and the children were buttoned into their coats for morning chores, Georgia stepped out with Yates to the barn. The sky was pale and cloudless, but the air burned the lungs. She carried a small tin of nails in one hand and he brought the hammer. They worked without a word. She held the boards in place while he hammered. Her breath clouded in the air and her fingers stiffened despite her mittens. "You ever build anything before?" he asked, not looking up. "No," she said, "but I've had to hold things together longer than I can remember." He paused, eyes on hers. "You always speak that plain." "Only when I think a man might listen." He gave a small nod, then returned to the wall. A hawk rode the sky above them, wheeling slow circles near the ridge. Georgia watched it a moment, then picked up another board. By noon, the barn wall stood tighter than it had all year. Yates leaned back and wiped his brow with his sleeve. Georgia stepped back to check the straightness. "You ever think about building something more than fences and walls?" she asked. He looked at her, caught off guard. "Like what?" she shrugged. "A smokehouse, a second room, a porch wide enough for a rocking chair." He was quiet for a long while. "Then, I never thought there'd be anyone to sit in one." She bent down, gathered the leftover nails. Well, there is now. Inside, Danny was stacking kindling under Daisy's direction, careful and proud. Georgia stepped in and kissed the top of his head without a word. Yates watched from the doorway, dusting off his hands but didn't move. Later that evening, Georgia brought out a bundle of wool she'd been saving. She laid it across the table and began cutting. Yates leaned nearby, arms crossed. "You sewing something?" he asked. "A winter coat for Danny. He's outgrowing the last one." "I'll stitch Daisy a cloak from what's left." He studied the cloth. "They're enough for you." Georgia didn't look up. "I've gone through colder years with less." He stepped forward, pulling a folded bundle from the cupboard. "I kept this. My mother's. She used to wear it in Missouri winters. I figure it's useless sitting in a drawer." Georgia unfolded it, thick wool, faded but whole. She held it to her chest, then looked up. "You don't owe me anything," she said. He met her eyes. "I know. I'm giving it anyway." She folded the coat along its seams and set it aside. Her hands lingered on the fabric. That night, after the children were asleep and the fire had burned low, Georgia stepped out onto the porch. The moon was high and the sky was endless. Yates joined her, a blanket draped over his shoulders. "I haven't stood still this long in a long time," she said. "You don't have to run anymore." She turned her head toward him. "And if I don't know how to stay," he looked out toward the hills, "then we'll learn it together." She didn't answer. Just stepped closer, close enough that their shoulders touched. Yates didn't move, and neither did she. The first snow came with a hush, as if the world was holding its breath. Georgia stepped out early, the hem of her skirt brushing pale drifts as she emptied dishwater behind the cabin. The air smelled like cedar and frost. From the barn, Yates's voice rose low and steady, guiding Daisy through a milking lesson. Danny sat on the porch bundled in a patched coat, carving lines into the frost-silvered rail with a stick. Inside, the fire still held from the night before. Georgia warmed her hands, then pressed them to her cheeks. Her palms smelled faintly of soap and wood smoke. She reached for a tin of dried corn and began sorting kernels for supper. Later that afternoon, Yates brought in a leather satchel filled with rabbit pelts, snow clinging to the hem of his trousers. He closed the door behind him, shaking off the cold, and placed the satchel on the table. "Traps were full," he said. Georgia eyed the pelts. "You planning to sell them?" "Trade, mostly. Salt, maybe oil if I can find a decent barrel." "You need anything from town?" She hesitated. "Thread, if there's any to be had," he nodded. "I'll leave at dawn." She dried her hands on her apron and walked to the cupboard, pulling down a small parcel wrapped in muslin. "Take this, then." She placed it in his hand. "The last of the dried apples. Might fetch something extra at the mercantile." He turned the parcel over. "You made these?" "I don't keep things just to keep them." His eyes searched hers. "You trust me to come back?" She folded her arms. "I wouldn't send the apples if I didn't." That night, she stayed up after the children had gone to bed, darning a tear in the elbow of his second shirt. The fire cracked soft behind her. She didn't hear him come in from chopping wood until his boots scuffed against the floorboards. "You don't have to mend that," he said. "I know." He leaned against the wall, arms folded. "You sleep much these days?" She didn't look up. "Enough. You dream?" She paused in her stitching. "Sometimes." "What about?" She looked over at him. "Not the past." He nodded once. "That's something." She returned to her work. "What about you?" "I dream of fences that never fall, quiet mornings. A roof that holds. You have all those." He looked at her, not the shirt. "Not all." She didn't answer, but her hands slowed on the thread. The next morning, the wind had shifted. Yates left before sunrise, taking the mare and the rabbit pelts. Georgia stood at the door after he'd gone, the children still asleep, her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. By midday, she boiled potatoes and turned the drying rack to face the window. Danny read aloud from an old primer while Daisy practiced knitting with an uneven rhythm. When evening fell and he hadn't returned, she lit the lantern early. Snow began again in fine, slanting lines. The children asked once, then fell silent. Georgia set extra wood by the hearth and checked the latch on the door twice. She didn't eat that night. Just after the hour turned, hoofbeats sounded against the packed snow. Georgia opened the door before he had reached the steps. He handed her the satchel first. Thread. A whole spool. She took it without speaking, then reached for his arm. His coat was wet through and his knuckles raw. "You should have stayed in town. That wind's turned dangerous." "I said I'd come back." She stepped aside, letting him in. The children, half asleep by the fire, roused enough to see him, then drifted off again. She poured coffee. He took it with both hands, warming his fingers on the tin mug. She sat across from him, the room quiet but for the fire. "I got the oil too," he said. "Traded the apples for a half-barrel. Clerk said they tasted like summer." She smiled, faint and fleeting. "They were dried in July." He looked at her, then reached into his coat. "I brought something else." He placed a folded piece of cloth on the table. "For Daisy, found it with the trading goods." Georgia unfolded it, a square of wool in a dusky rose. "She'll make a shawl. She needs one." She refolded the cloth. "You remember things, that matters." He met her gaze. "So do you." She touched the edge of the wool, then looked down at her hands. "I used to think nothing good would last." "What changed?" "I did," she said. "When I started believing you meant what you said." He leaned forward, elbows on the table. "I mean everything I say to you." She didn't look away. "Then say this, you want me to stay." He set down the mug. "I want you to stay." She reached across the table, slid her hand over his. "Then I will." He turned his palm to catch hers, and neither of them let go. Rain came late that spring, soft and steady, soaking the fields and leaving the earth dark and rich beneath their boots. Georgia stood out by the vegetable rows, skirts damp to the knees, turning the soil with a long-handled hoe. Her braids stuck to the back of her neck, but she worked without pause. Yates set a crate down near the porch, wiping his sleeve across his brow. "You're planting early." "I've watched the birds," she said. "They came back sooner this year." He crouched to check the rows she'd marked with string. "You chose the south slope. Good light." She looked over at him. "You say that like you didn't expect it." "I say that like a man who thought he'd be explaining it." She let out a quiet breath that wasn't quite laughter. "I've lived beside fields before." He stood, brushing soil from his hands. "You never said. You never asked." Later that week, he brought home a second axe, the head worn but still sound. He left it where she could find it, leaning against the tool shed. When she came in that evening, she set it beside the door, then cut 2 slices of cornbread and slid one across the table toward him. He didn't touch it at first. "You think I'm trying to make you stay useful?" She folded her hands in her lap. "I think you're showing me you see what I can do." He picked up the bread. "You're not what I expected. You never said what you expected." "I didn't know until you sat at this table like it belonged to you." She pressed her fingers to the edge of her cup. Her voice dropped. "I've lived in rooms where I was only tolerated. There's a difference." He didn't look away. "You're wanted here." She nodded once and finished her tea. That Sunday, she found a small linen sack tucked behind the flour tin. Inside, a handful of dried wildflowers tied with a string. She didn't ask where he'd found them. She just placed them in a jar near the window, beside the pepper plant Daisy had started from seed. One evening, as the sun settled behind the ridge and the chickens rustled quiet in their coop, Danny came in with a crooked grin and a bundle of feathers. "Found them near the creek," he said. "Might be good for fletching." Yates turned the bundle over in his hand. "You know what to do with these. I watched you last winter." Georgia pulled a basin from the shelf. "Well then, let's get them cleaned." Later, when the children were in bed, Georgia sat by the fire, a mending basket in her lap. Yates carved a thin sliver of wood, shaping the shaft of an arrow. "You ever think about leaving here?" he asked. She didn't look up. "Not anymore." He paused. "Why not?" "Because I don't feel like I'm passing through." He set the carving down. "I used to think quiet meant empty. What do you think now?" "I think it means peace." She threaded her needle again, eyes on her work. "You've changed since I came. I've started hoping again." She met his gaze. "For what?" He leaned forward, voice low. "That you might stay for good, not just for shelter, not just for the children." She set her basket aside. "I wasn't waiting for you to say it. I've already made up my mind." His voice didn't rise, but his hand reached across, calloused fingers brushing hers. "You have." "I don't leave people I love," she said. He stilled. "You love me." "I do." The fire snapped, and she didn't pull away. He closed his hand around hers. "Then I'll build whatever you need, Georgia. A second room, a porch wide enough for rockers, a home that shows it." Her voice was steady. "You already have." And in that quiet room, with the night pressing soft against the windows, they sat together, hands joined, hearts spoken, and knew they were no longer alone. The summer sun burned slow and golden over the ridgeline, softening the edge of the days and stretching the shadows long. Georgia stood near the back fence, a small basket in hand, picking the last of the early beans from vines she'd coaxed up from dry earth. Her hands moved steady, practiced, and her eyes flicked to the children now and again. Daisy crouched beside the henhouse, whispering something to a broody hen, and Danny swinging a stick through tall grass, pretending it was a cavalry saber. Yates came up behind her with a quiet tread, carrying a mason's line and a wooden measure. His shirt was damp at the collar, and his sleeves were rolled past the elbow. He looked out over the pasture, then down at the cleared patch near the well. "I marked the frame," he said. "If you want to see it." She brushed a curl from her cheek with the back of her wrist. "You're certain the ground's firm enough, dug down past the frost line, laid gravel, it'll hold?" She set the basket down and walked beside him to the clearing. Stakes were driven into the soil in a rough rectangle, twine stretched taut between them. "This is where you want it?" he asked. She turned once, gauging the sun. "Morning light through the east window, that's what I want for the loom." He nodded. "Then I'll build it facing east." The days that followed were full of hammer strikes and sawdust. Georgia kept the children close enough to help, but out of the way. Daisy learned how to braid straw for the roof's edge. Danny fetched nails from the cloth bag whenever Yates called for them. The rhythm of the work settled into the bones of the house, quiet, sure, deliberate. One evening, Georgia brought out blackberry preserves she'd bartered for with a neighbor who raised goats. They ate them on fresh bread, seated on the front steps as the breeze cooled the sweat from their necks. "You thinking of weaving again?" Yates asked, watching her spread the preserves with the back of the spoon. "I never stopped thinking about it," she said, then passed him the plate. "But this time I'll do it for myself." He held her gaze a moment. "You used to make for someone else." She didn't look away. "I sold work to keep standing, never knew what it was used for after, never saw it worn. You'll see it now." She smiled, slow and real, and took a bite of bread. The weaving room was finished by high summer. A single wide window faced east like she'd asked, and the walls were left bare so she could hang skeins of dyed yarn. Georgia stood in the doorway with her arms folded, eyes shining just a little. Yates stood behind her, hands on his hips. "You built it exactly like I pictured," she said. "I built it how you spoke about it." She turned to face him. "You've given me more than space. You've given me back something I thought I'd lost." "What's that?" "The shape of my own life." He reached out, brushing her cheek with the back of his fingers. "You never lost it. You just needed someone to hold the door open." They stood there a while, The scent of sun warmed wood rising around them. That night, the moon hung low and orange, and the children were curled under quilts Georgia had stitched through the winter. She stepped out onto the porch, shawl loose around her shoulders. Yates was seated on the bench he'd built from an old wagon axle, whittling a spoon from a piece of ash. She sat beside him, close but not touching. The crickets sang low from the grass. "I've been thinking," she said. "Dangerous thing," he replied, lips twitching. She nudged his boot with hers. "I want to marry you." He set the spoon down slow. "You sure that's not just the blackberry preserves talking?" She turned her head. "I've had enough of being spoken for. I want to speak for myself." He reached for her hand. "Then I'd better ask you proper, hadn't I? You just did." He kissed her knuckles, slow and reverent. "Then it's settled." They married beneath the cottonwood tree behind the barn, with Daisy carrying a crown of wildflowers and Danny holding a ring carved from walnut. The preacher came from the next town over, and the neighbors brought cornbread, pickled onions, and jars of cider. The sun stayed high, the clouds stayed thin, and Georgia wore a dress she'd sewn from fine cream muslin, the hem just brushing the grass. After the vows, she stood with Yates beneath the open sky, and the wind toyed with the loose ends of her braid. "I never thought I could have this," she said. "You didn't have to," he replied. "You only had to have me." She touched his chest, right over the beat of his heart. "You've always been here, I just didn't know what to call it." "Call it home," he said. Years passed and the land bloomed under their care. Georgia's weaving caught the eye of travelers, and soon, folks rode in from as far as Rock Springs to buy her rugs and shawls. Yates built a smokehouse and a second barn, and Danny learned to shoe horses by the time he was 12. Daisy grew tall and sure-handed, good with animals and herbs alike. They buried the old hen by the peach tree one spring and planted a second apple sapling near the porch. Seasons turned, and the roof held, and the fences never fell. On warm evenings, Georgia and Yates sat on the porch with their hands clasped, watching the light stretch across the hills. They didn't speak much, didn't need to. The silence between them was full, and in that silence there was no loneliness left, only the deep-rooted peace of two people who had chosen each other every day, who had made a life not out of chance but out of quiet, steady love. And it was enough. More than enough, forever.